We don't always agree on how to get there. The one thing we do agree is we're pretty much aligned on where we want to be. So thank you, and thank you both for your tireless efforts on behalf of the children of Washington State, and on behalf of this oversight committee. It is kind of a new experiment in what we do. So thank you both, and I promise I'll have more to say at the next meeting.
Well, thank you, Tom, and we all wish you well quickly. Thank you for joining us today. And congratulations on being elected the new co-chair.
Yay, thank you. Yes, and again, I echo that. Godspeed, may you recover quickly, and excited to pass on the reins. So actually, Representative Katie, her term is not necessarily up, but given the kind of where we are, progress that we have made, and kind of our societal changes, she recognized / brought forward the suggestion that that we look at a potentially different community representative for to be co-chair, and so that is why this is coming up. And so I would like to open up the floor, and I know Representative Katie has a nominee to nominate the community representative for co-chair. Representative Katie.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sad and joyful to leave this role. I decided that after 2 years, as you said, this board is really off on solid footing, and that it's time to turn over the reins and bring new leadership to this oversight board. And I'm particularly concerned about our leadership reflecting the racial equity and diversity that this oversight board is so committed to. So I am very pleased to nominate Shronda Sullivanoff to be our new co-chair. She has, I don't even know how many years ago it was, maybe 6, maybe 8, where I first met Shronda. She came to the legislature to testify in front of my committee. And she was so articulate on her experience as a parent going through the child welfare system, and how a caseworker and a clinician made a tremendous difference in her faith in herself, her ability to engage in services and recover, and eventually get her children back. And her empathy for parents and her understanding of the tremendous barriers they face and how to address those was truly inspirational. She has successfully navigated this system, and has taken her experiences and really transformed them into specific policy ideas and practice ideas that can greatly improve our system. So I think that kind of systems understanding and focus would be a tremendous, tremendous boon to the board, along with her lived experience. Shronda really has a strong belief in the power of policy change. And of course, that's what this oversight board is all about. She is such an effective voice for parents that she has become a national spokesperson and sits on national advisory boards, and in fact, could not join us at noon and will join us at 12:30 because she was presenting on a national webinar. So I think we're so fortunate to have Shronda in this state and working with us, and really think that she will continue to crystallize the inherent challenges in child welfare and child care and juvenile justice and really help the Oversight Board move forward in a very progressive way. So Shrounda,
Thank you. Actually, I would like to ask for a second to the nomination.
This is Annie Blackledge. I would be honored to be the second. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right.
sorry, got it a little out of order there.
No worries. No, it was great. It's like, I think exactly what you said. I don't think I need to ask if anybody else would like to make any comments about Rhonda.
This is Annie Blackledge. I would like to say that Sharonda is an amazing professional. And I think oftentimes in this work, given that I'm an alumni of foster care and Sharonda is a parent representative, that people would see us as being at odds. And we are not. And it's because of her amazing dedication to this work and really looking at the whole family, including the parents and the children, and her dedication to preserving that is incredible. And I'm just so honored to think of her as a co-leader, also honored to have her serve with Representative Dent.
Thank you. That is lovely as well. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Okay, thank you. So Shonda, would you like to say anything before we vote on your co-chair position?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just share a couple words. First of all, thank you, Ruth, for the nomination and Annie for seconding it. It's always humbling to have people say such kind words about yourself, about you. And of course, what I can tell you is it just speaks to the transformation that happens when you have caring adults that show up in your life during your most desperate and vulnerable times and pour into you. So yes, I've known Ruth for a multitude of years. I've shown up as a individual that might be able to share just a little bit of insight to what it looks like to navigate child welfare. And I hope more importantly to instill hope into others. As I look at the opportunity to sit in this position, I would only be remiss to talk, not to mention the legacy of Tana and Ruth, of what you have built. I think that we started off at some, we were, in its infancy. I think that the opportunity are big shoes to fill, but I always just like to walk in my own because that's the only place, that's the only path I've ever been on. And I'm just honored for the opportunity to gather all of our insight, information, and continue to inform and support families moving through child welfare, early learning, and JRA. And I'd also just like to say that the board that, while there might be, positions of leadership, that we're really just one, and that we're walking through this together, learning and growing with one another, all with the shared vision of really trying to create change and opportunities for those that might find themselves in some desperate conditions.
Beautifully said. Well, we welcome your path. With that, I would like to ask the board, all those in favor of Shonda Sulivanoff being our next co-chair, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Congratulations, co-chairs Dent and Sulivanoff. Woohoo! We are very excited. Thank you guys both for stepping up. Both Ruth and I are excited to hand over the reins. Like, bye-bye. No, kidding, of course. And truly, we are actually so kind that we are not even going to put you on the spot right away, but we are going to continue to host this meeting and look forward to you guys running future meetings. So thank you both for stepping up, being willing to serve, and we look forward to the perspectives and the leadership that you bring to this board and to this conversation. So thank you very much. And now I think it's back to Krista to talk about the report.
Yes, thank you. And congratulations both to Representative Tom Dent and Shonda. I look forward to us starting our planning processes in the month or two to come. So we will be in contact about that. So our next agenda item is going to be, we have it set up. So I was going to go through a quick overview of the changes made since our last discussion about the report. Then we were going to break for public comment and then come back and do any further discussion and edits to the report before hopefully approving and finalizing it. So what I'll do real quick is I'm going to pull up the most recent draft of the report that was sent out a couple weeks ago, but also sent out yesterday to the board members. I'm going to go through, we have some new additions to the report that I'm not going to go through at this moment. You can read them on your own, but it includes the executive summary. The co-chairs have put in a draft of their letter at the beginning as well. So if you feel that you want to read that, but they might be working on finalizing a few things with that. But we've added an executive summary, which as always is just a real overview. One pager this time. I think last year we were at 2 or 3 pages. So we got it down to 1 page this year. So read that on your own time. If you have any edits to suggest about that, please recommend them. And then the rest of this part of the report has not changed at all since our last meeting because we had no edits to it. But on page 9, starting with the guidance section, which is where we really focused last time, I'm going to refer to what I printed out was our report from last meeting, notes made, and then point out the changes made. So bear with me as we try and navigate this. So in this first piece of guidance, the second bullet point here, we talked about the wording around the continuance of measuring and aligning data on racial and ethnic disproportionality. We had some discussion about whether or not we should list out the different systems that DCYF uses to collect data on race and ethnicity. We decided against that as a board because we thought that could be limiting to only list some systems, maybe not catch all of them. DCYF has a plethora of systems we know that they're working with. I think even within the early learning system, there's about 7 plus databases that they're trying to align within that. So we decided not to go down to the micro level of naming the systems. We did acknowledge, and we also did some additional language in this opening. So this happened throughout the report as well, that under every piece of guidance, we did want to call out and acknowledge where DCYF has made progress in these areas. So another point of discussion last meeting was to acknowledge the DCYF's new leadership in this role, and in particular, the changes they've made as of September even this year, which included deciding to integrate the strategic plan with the racial equity plan instead of treating them as separate entities. They're integrating both of them. They're also making this 8 stated outcome about eliminating racial and ethnic disparities in their systems their first priority that they're adding to that plan, a strategic plan, and some of the other progress they've made there. So those are the 2 main changes that were made from our discussion in our last session. So moving on from there, and again, we'll have time to
Would you like to, yeah, you're going to read through it, all of it, and then come back for discussion?
For time, yeah, I think if I go through real quick and highlight the changes, then after public comment, we can come back and walk through it all together if we want to make additional changes. So moving on to the second piece of guidance, which is the communication and providers piece. Main changes here was that we really, this first bullet point, we had a lot of rewording we wanted to do there about effectively and authentically engaging providers. So please, when you have time, go ahead. I'm not going to read that word for word right now. We can also do that after public comment if we think we need to. Additionally, there was some discussion on the second bullet point about the communications piece. We talked about making sure that everyone, if we're doing virtual communication, had the right equipment. We have included that, but we put it in a different part of the guidance section. It's farther down in the visitation piece. So just want to acknowledge that was discussed here, but we did place it later on the report that I'll make sure we point out. And then this last bullet point actually came from in part from some of our stakeholders as well as board members to really acknowledge that we need to work with providers or have department work with providers to ensure that the communications that are currently going on are working or not, or where it's not working, and then also to acknowledge providers as partners. So we've added that third bullet point here and changed some of the wording around that. Going down to the third one, there was a lot of discussion on the equitable access to visitation across all systems of care. We've added quite a bit of opening statement here to acknowledge the progress DCYF made and their quick and diligent ability to pivot and make sure services such as family time are readily available virtually or with the right equipment during COVID. But we also wanted to add from what the board has discussed this year about making sure that the youth in JR facilities had same access. So part of that was a discussion about the DOH guidelines that JR is responsible for following around COVID and ensuring the safety and well-being of both the youth in the facility and the staff. So this gets a little bit wordy, but wanted to acknowledge, and I tried to capture, I think, the intent of the board here to say that we want to make sure everyone is healthy and safe and follows the DOH guidelines, but there is maybe opportunity to be innovative and creative of how we can ensure that the JR youth are getting visitations as well, since at the time they had not since March. Now I heard updates recently from JR that beginning of November to mid-November, they were going to be able to provide those again, which is great. But maybe the board wants to maintain a little bit of an expectation there to make sure that there's a creative space around that to make sure they're continued. There was a request in this section to talk about, is there RCW to support this in the founding legislation of DCYF of the equitable access to these types of services across child welfare and the JR youth. What I looked for, there's RCW and I can pull it up, and it's up to the board whether or not they believe this is a supportive legislation. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick, which is the founding legislation of the department. I'm going to stop share and start a new share. Because there isn't necessarily something that specifically calls out this in the legislation. And again, this is up to whether the board feels this is appropriate. But the two that I considered when that request came through were either number 5 here in the findings of 43216005. This speaks mostly directly to the adolescent programs unit, but it does speak about the integration of child welfare and JR and increasing opportunities for those youth. The other option for an RCW, if we choose to cite an RCW, is number 7 here, which talks about the Department of Children, Youth, and Family must be anchored in a culture of innovation, transparency, accountability, and so on. And the reason I brought those up was just that I know that the intent, I believe, behind this obviously very valid concern that JR youth are having that social connection and maintaining those connections with their social network during this very intense and traumatic time with COVID. But also to acknowledge maybe there's more creative space and innovative space the department could work in to make sure that's happening. So I'll leave that now. If the board wants to talk about that and including that, the current draft we have does not have that cited. If the board would like to cite that in this draft, one of the two of those we can. And so from there, again, please read the DOH guidance section to make sure that we're acknowledging and balancing that to support that the department continues to follow those guidelines around COVID, but also make sure that we encourage those visitations to begin again when possible. And then the third bullet point under this section goes back to what I mentioned earlier about when there are virtual visitations to ensure that all sides of that connection and that communication have the equipment that they need, which is we saw happen again in the family time space early on when we went virtual, and just ensuring that continues with these engagements in different areas. So under number 4, changes here were really to include again more language in this opening statement to acknowledge the uniqueness and the arc of the adolescent space. That was a specific request, and also that kind of goes into our guidance pieces here that say that, you know, working with adolescents is not only very important and we need to call that out, and there's promise in DCYF to have this unit, but also that it might be managed a little bit differently than some of our early childhood programs. And related to that, we have this third bullet, which was about the streamlining the licensing process. And there was a lot of discussion around that. And this really was just reflective of some of that language to acknowledge being sensitive to those needs to make sure the adolescent needs are met, and they don't, early childhood licensing might not apply fully to the adolescent space. And then also encouraging the adolescent program unit to be a leader in that work as the department works on it. So moving on to the 5th section. Again, added language here in the opening comments, really to acknowledge that DCYF is one of the first of the 8 states to get their FFPSA plan approved. So really applauding them for that, and getting excited to see how the prioritizing prevention services and that funding is moving forward, to acknowledge and applaud them. We've also made the change to the second bullet. So there was a lot of discussion around this, and this was referring to when we think about early on, we engaged the department on updates to COVID. And I believe it was Secretary Hunter and also Vicky Ibarra talked a little bit about discovering how virtual services and treatment options might actually be a great supplement to areas, particularly where there might be treatment deserts in some of the, or service deserts in some parts of our state. But they want to be very intentional about that and very ensure that those services are effective, but also of choice of those who are receiving them. And so the wording last time when we looked at this was more or less, had some wording that was a little bit up for interpretation about appropriateness and so on and so forth. And so here, change some of the language to make sure that it would be by voluntary choice of the individual receiving them, that would work for them, but also to ensure that it would be proven effective through the evaluation process of DCYF, doing a very kind of data-driven evaluation process. I have asked for a little bit of an update on what that evaluation process looks like and haven't received feedback yet. And granted, I asked very recently, so I don't want to put that on DCYF. That was me requesting some information on that. But please look at that wording, and we can discuss that again further in a little bit in our meeting. And then the third bullet, this was also a lot of discussion around this. Originally, we had said something about the potential of closing down lockdown facilities in JR. We, as a board, discussed we didn't really have that conversation with DCYF, and we focused so much of this report and its guidance based on the conversations we had in our meetings as a full board with DCYF. I think we heard some snippets from leadership in DCYF that this was being considered or thought about, and I think there was just a comfort level of saying that we haven't had that full discussion and don't have particular guidance from the board about that. That said, there has been a lot of discussion about the capacity and potential of step-down facilities and community facilities. And I know that DCYF is putting forward legislation on that this year as well. So this third bullet point was really to rephrase that and say, you know, the board supports that and really would like to see more of that kind of opportunity for the youth that are currently in lockdown facilities, but might be eligible for the community step-down facilities and currently don't have the space for it or the capacity. So. And with those, we move on to the specific program area of guidance that we really came out of our meetings directly on these topics about. We didn't have much changes to the early learning, which was really about the inter-rater reliability training for the childcare licensor. We heard a lot about that discussion that the DCYF was doing that, COVID happened, but we want to make sure that we get back to that. So our childcare providers have consistency across the state and who their licensor is. And then the internal review process as well. So marketing and getting that information out. And the board is playing a part in that now that we have our application up to get those providers who would like to participate and serve on that panel. So again, encouraging the department to do so as well. And I know they have changes they would like to pursue in the future, but it's in there now. And so we want to make sure that that is available if requested. Under number 2, under the child welfare piece, this first bullet, we did do some language change on that to reflect our most recent conversation with DCYF, which is really about the strategies to address hotel stays, the increase in hotel stays and office stays as of late. So some of this language reflects what Secretary Hunter was talking about with that pilot program and having those beds available, including some additional wording on therapeutic foster homes and treatment foster care beds. So I encourage board members to take a look at that since that's some new language, and we can discuss that further again a little bit in our meeting. And then additional changes going down to the JR space. The second bullet here was there was a lot of discussion about the vocational educational opportunities, both to include not only trade school educational opportunities, but also secondary school opportunities. So that's included. And then also a way to engage and reflect on a gender inclusive approach to trade school options. We heard that from one of the young members, a female member that, or a female resident in one of the JR facilities, talk about, you know, the options there were great, but there's a lot of other options that she would like to pursue and have access to for her future and building those skills. So that's been added. And then for clarification, this third point was to discuss the option to build financial credit while serving in a JR facility, which before it just had credit. So there was a little bit of confusion on what that was referring to. And then after that, there has been a last page here that has kind of a thank you to our co-chairs, and then a welcome to our new co-chairs, as we just had at the beginning of this agenda. So we will update that as after this meeting. And then we talk about the Oversight Strategy Subcommittee and the work going forward with that. So even though we don't have any more regular scheduled Oversight Board meetings for the rest of this calendar year, the Oversight Subcommittee on Strategy is meeting the beginning of December to continue that work. And then we talk a little bit about 2020 and the focus going forward. This is an interesting balance of making sure that we're keeping our eye on some of the very top priority issues that we've talked about this last year, including the racial and ethnic disparities and disproportionality check-ins, to make sure we're keeping a constant oversight and monitoring of progress being made in that space. And some other topics that maybe this year got pushed back a little bit because of COVID and other issues that arose. But we also want to really capture the flexibility and responsiveness of the board that I think is really interested in adapting now moving forward, to make sure that when things arise, the board hears it and has a response to it. And then of course, a concluding statement, as well as our appendices after that. So with that, I'm actually not even clear where we are on the agenda, but we were going to pivot to public comment, and I would like to ask Nicholas if there's anyone that has signed up for public comment.
Yes, we have one person signed up, so we can go ahead and transition to that now.
Okay, let's do that, and then we will come back and do a final review and discussion of the report itself. So I'll hand it over to you, Nicholas. Go ahead.
Perfect. So public comment today is Lori Lippold. So Lori, please feel free to unmute yourself and give your comment.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all. And I figure somebody has to comment, right? So first of all, I just want to extend my thanks and gratitude to Representative Kagan and Representative Sen for your leadership in making this all come to life. I mean, you're the ones who created what we are seeing. So I really am grateful for all the time and energy you put into this, and the inclusiveness that you have kind of made us all feel. So, and then of course, my major congratulations to Representative Dent and Sharonda. I think they'll be a very strong leadership team, and I'm really excited to see how the Oversight Board continues to evolve. I am very grateful that the work of the subcommittee will continue. I think you all know this has been a big issue around oversight and implementation and things like that. So I'm very grateful and encouraged that that work will go on. And I'm also really glad, I mean, the bullet points that you put forward for 2021 work are all good. I am particularly excited about the kinship work. This is something I know DCYF has been very interested in, and it's hard to find a role because so many kinship caregivers are, quote, in the informal caregiving system, and how we can make sure that there are supports for families going through that, down that path, but also really how can we better support the kinship families who are coming through the more formal DCYF doors. So I think there's a lot of good stuff that is going to come, and I look forward to my ability to continue to observe and chime in periodically. I guess one other thing, and maybe this is to the new chairs, again, I think I have mentioned, it's always kind of difficult when people, and we hear people present and give comments, and they say things, and then you don't know what happened to it. So that follow-up and really having a sense of, okay, there were these issues that came up. Is there a way to do some kind of follow-up so we all have a sense of any action that was taken that can be public or whatever, just so there's kind of that ability to know what happened next. Anyway, thank you all very much. Appreciate what you are all doing.
Great, thank you, Lori. That was it for public comment, so we'll turn it back over to Krista.
Okay, thank you. So what we will do, I think we're gonna go back to the report itself and kind of do what we did last time and just walk through and based on what I said were changes, if there's any additional comments, edits, we'll do that live here as a board so we can make sure that we get this done on time to get it submitted for processing next week. So I will pull this up again. Let me see here. So are there any, if anyone's had a chance to read some of the sections, as I said, we're not necessarily going to go through, and I apologize, I know when I scroll like this, sometimes it's nauseating to watch on the screen. Again, some of this is just summary and it's content, so I don't want to spend too much time, but is there any, from the beginning, any additional thoughts or changes to such spaces of the executive summary that somehow were missed or need to be called out differently? If anyone has any, I'm not saying that there should be, just want to give space and time if anyone has any comments about it, if they've had a chance to look at it. No, okay. And again, this really summarizes what's in the report, so there shouldn't be anything new or different here. It walks through the report, summarizes the guidance and different pieces we have in bullet point form, and then talks about our work moving forward into 2021. So,
Krista, did we talk at all in the child welfare space? I mean, we did talk extensively about the issue of hotel stays and overnights in offices.
oh,
And I'm wondering if, we should include in this section expanding placement opportunities. We talk about it in the report, but it's really restricted to treatment foster care and therapeutic foster care. And I think it should include all appropriate placements for behaviorally, for challenged youth.
you're saying that we need to just make that more explicit in the executive summary, or you want to change the content of that guidance piece to include?
Well, foster care modeling. Okay, when I read that, I thought it was more a change in the practice model. So it's developing and investing in expanded placement opportunities for foster youth. Maybe it's a separate bullet.
Separate than this one? Or do you want to change that word?
Just add to it, and other placement option, expanded options, right?
Okay.
That's good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or feedback on the executive summary piece? And again, we'll just update it with our new co-chairs when we went outside this meeting. The background section and this whole area has not been changed since probably one of the first drafts you've seen, so I'm not going to slow us down with that. And similarly here, the statement that the board passed remains the same. We did, I've got to change here. Oops, that was not what I wanted to do. My apologies. Live editing. So that would be the statement that the board had passed, and we have that called out. And if you're, I talked to some members before too, obviously the spacing can get wonky just because we're in draft mode. So we'll make sure that all the spacing is works out well. So
Krista, we talked earlier today about the language accepted status quo narrative. And I think we should just clarify, oh, you did clarify to end societies, because I didn't want to imply in this report that DCYF has an acceptance of the status quo narrative of disproportionality. I think they're actively trying to change it.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Ruth. And if we want to, I'll give space for board members to reflect on that too. There was just a word added here to say that when we wrote this, it was really to say that to capture this concept of society's kind of accepted as a status quo that there's racial and ethnic disparities and disproportionality throughout human services. And really we're just getting at saying that that shouldn't be the status quo and accepted by society anymore. And the way the wording was, as Ruth mentioned, didn't want to claim that DCYF wasn't prioritizing this, but really to say that this status quo really across our country is no longer acceptable, and that we're working with DCYF to address that. Are there any thoughts around that? Again, just the addition of the word society within that sentence. Okay. So we're back to the guidance section. So I'm gonna just kind of open it up based on the changes I had mentioned. And if you've had time to review or want a few minutes to review, based on the changes in our last discussion, to our first call to action, which is the urgency to respond to call for racial justice and through action. Are there any suggested edits or discussion around this first section in the guidance from any board members?
So I was reflecting, since we wrote this, I believe the CARES Act dollars funded the Department of Equity, the state agency, and I don't necessarily have a specific action item, except I thought it was worth noting. That we should encourage DCYF to work closely with the Department of Equity to, do probably a variety of things. Communicate better, make sure people know about their services, to accept their feedback and their expertise in reviewing equity issues, or something about just working together with the Department of Equity as well.
And I'll open that up to other board members. What's the comfort level with that? I know that we haven't talked about the Office of Equity directly as a board. And I know they're just forming, they're trying to figure out their scope of work too. Is there any thoughts on wanting to include that or not? Just want to make sure we're talking about it as a full board too.
No, I think it's a good idea.
Anyone
Could be
else?
included just on the third bullet too. Just you could just say expands internal focus and works with the. But again, I want to hear from other board members first.
This is Bobby. Maybe just acknowledging the newly formed Office of Equity, or whatever its real title is. In that last sentence that you're trying to put an add on here, and work closely with the newly formed Office of Equity. Where's the Office of Equity going to be? Is it in the governor's office?
Yeah.
Okay, then we should say that too, I think.
Then it's like the three branches working together.
Yeah.
Well, I guess DCYF is an agency,
Right.
But still,
Yeah, but my point was that to just acknowledge that we're not saying much more about this because it's new. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And I'll do a final review to make sure it just flows, but I won't change the content around that to make sure it's accurate. All right, so any other comments about this section? Okay. So moving on to the second section with the community provider or communications and provider relationships, excuse me. Are there any additional thoughts, edits, suggestions for this section based on changes made since our last meeting?
So, Krista, when you were going over this section, you mentioned the technology, and then you said it's in the next section.
Yeah.
I did, and then when we got to the next section, it looked like it was pretty focused still just on visitation. And I think we did discuss, just like what we heard from kids in JR, that their families didn't necessarily have technology to communicate with them as families, so like the youth might, but the family and the community didn't. And so, again, personally, I would like to hear other board members' thoughts, making sure that we do extend that, kind of the recognition that we want to make sure that that technology does not create any barriers or exacerbate any barriers for family connections in any of the systems, or for any, anybody to get the needed services DCYF is trying to provide.
Okay. So you're right. I mean, the next section is focused on visitation, but you want to expand maybe the second bullet to just make sure that anyone involved in the systems, that technology is not a barrier to connection. Is that accurate?
Again, if people agree with that.
Could you move back up to the title of this? No, I'll finish your thought, sorry. Okay, so this is generalized communication and provider relationships.
Which I think too, now that you say that, I request maybe Lois, if you're on there, to chime in. I think there was some discussion about, we heard from the child care providers as well, that not all providers have access to the right technology to do virtual visits, or there's maybe some training needed there as well. Do we want to do some language around that to be more inclusive?
Yeah, because the bullet you're in right now is talking about frequency and expectations of communication with children, youth, families, well, providers, and the DCYF workforce. Okay.
Lois, were you going to chime in too? I think I might have heard you. Maybe not.
I was going to say this, Tom, again, I was going to say that, definitely, I think as we're looking at the early learning providers and what they're having to deal with school-age children, and having to make sure that they have, enough broadband and Wi-Fi and earphones and plugs, and understand iPad and versus laptop versus phone versus whatever, technology kids are bringing in to do their schoolwork. Childcare providers are facing serious technological challenges as well. So I think kind of talking about technology overall is something, so we heard it in Visitation, we heard it in JR, we heard it in early learning.
This is Diane. I just have a note, which is in the medical world, provider means something completely different than in the early childhood world. And this, if this makes sense to all of you, to not necessarily spell out what providers you're speaking about in this section, or whether you think it might be helpful somewhere early on where we put in what basically identify child care providers, or what providers we're referring to, just for the reader's standpoint. In other words, in medicine, a provider is a medical provider. It's a, and so this just seems different to me. I don't know whether if that's confusing to other people.
I think that I take provider to mean, this is generic section. This is not just talking about child welfare or early learning, right? This is general guidance.
Right.
Yeah, so provider is provider, as it is deemed, whether it's in, medical or it's a provider of services to all clients of DCYF.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to capture here, is across all kind of three.
And we're talking pretty globally here.
Yeah, exactly. And that maybe this down here, the providers as partners of the agency for serving in service to family and children, is kind of trying to capture all of that. So it could be anywhere from the early childhood field to, our family time provider. There's a lot of different providers that are working with the department. So do we want to reorder this? Do we want to clarify that language to be inclusive to all providers serving children and families?
And Diane, is there a particular concern with any of the recommendations that they really don't make sense to the medical community, or what is the specific concern?
Well, I think honestly for me, it's just the word provider I have challenges with because I think it means a lot of different things to different people. So somebody just said providers of, I don't know if we just kind of maybe, and maybe we don't need to do this, this is all self-explanatory to the rest of you, but if it's something to the extent of saying like, right, even in the top where it says communications and provider relationships, providers of services for DCYF or something like that, that we just sort of clarified right there that it's a global statement. It's not just referring to childcare. It's not just referring, that it's more of a broader gestalt of providers.
Could you just say
Communication and relationships with providers of services or with service providers.
Yeah, maybe just adding service providers would be helpful. So nobody else has an issue with that, maybe.
Well, you're the only doctor.
Yeah.
All right, well, that helps me. So that's an N of 1 here. Thank you.
That's it. Yeah, that's service providers. That's still broad.
I see Charles.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just laughing because I was saying, oh no, it seems really straightforward to me, but I'm in this world every day. So
This is Annie, and I like the clarification because I do feel like there's an increased responsibility or expectation for DCYF to be having strong communication with its providers that they have contracts with, and that's who we've been hearing from primarily in the comments. So I do think it's a great distinction to add that language, or DCYF service providers or contractors.
No, service providers, don't get too narrow. We want this broad.
Would DCYF service providers work? I know contractors also, we have some that are not contracted, but still need to.
That's what I mean. That's why I think this is broad. These are broad statements of,
Yeah.
I think as long as you modify providers by service, it seems like we got it.
Do we need to now also say in families or something? Because we do talk about communications with children, youth, families, and providers. So now we have communications and relationships modifying service providers. So do we need to say in families or something like that?
Yep. Yeah, because it's broader.
Does that work? Okay.
I like that.
Yeah, I think it says, I mean, I'm a nitpicker on does the topic, does the headline match to what the substance is in the middle? It frequently, that rule is frequently abandoned by newspapers, and it bothers me. So since this is in a repertorial mode, I think it's good because that says what we're talking about in the bullet points.
Good point. Yeah, we do call out communication.
With kids and families. Yeah. But you don't want to make it so long that.
Right. And then it sounds like we might want to add in here another bullet just to ensure that technology is not a barrier for that engagement or communication, no matter who it is, right? Okay.
Right.
So I'll add in that. Okay. So with no further thoughts on this section, I think we're robust conversation. Okay. So moving on to the equitable and accessible visitation across systems of care. Again, changes here were just to add in a little bit more in the intro paragraph to acknowledge what DCYF did do during COVID, and then add in some additional information about acknowledging the need to abide by DOH's guidelines for those youth in lockdown facilities, but encouraging the department to get a little bit creative in that space as well. So are there any thoughts or recommended edits, suggestions in this part?
Well, I just wondered why the prevent child abuse and neglect wasn't checked. Certainly visitation and support for parents is important to preventing child abuse and neglect. So I'd recommend adding it.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I think that was originally the section. I appreciate catching that too, because I think originally the section was very focused on visitation and JR. And so we just want to, we're happy to add that. So I will make a note. Nicholas is the one that's the master of updating these charts, because every time I touch them, I mess them up. So I will make sure that we get that in there for that section.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or discussion about how this is phrased, or trying to capture that sense of health, safety, but also need for the social connection? Okay. My dog continues to snore in the background, so I apologize if you can hear that. I'm trying to get her to readjust her positioning a little bit, but that doesn't always work. So moving on to number 4, which is capitalize on adolescent programs unit. Again, just the updates here were to really flesh out that first paragraph, acknowledge that this is a brand new part of DCYF and a really exciting piece in the work that's been done, as well as the importance of this focus. And then that second paragraph about that licensing process and being aware and intentional about the age groups and what their needs are around licensing to provide services for those youth. Any thoughts on this section?
It's good, I think. This is Bobby.
Okay, thank you, Bobby.
Yeah, I think throughout this, Krista, you've really done a good job of balancing the, really complimenting the department on the work they have done and continuing to push in areas that need more attention. So thank you for getting such a balanced approach incorporated into the report.
Yeah, here.
Well, thank you, Ruth. I know that was something that you encouraged as well. So I appreciate that that's reflected well. Okay, so hearing none on this section, we're moving down to number 5. So this is really about the investments and investing in prevention, which again is a cornerstone of DCYF and making sure there's prevention services. And this reflects on our budget principles that we came up with early in the year, but also talking about kind of the uniqueness of our year in 2020 and what information that's brought to light and needs there. So are there any suggestions, edits, comments on this section?
So there's a little bit of to me, a conflicting message here to optimize savings with virtual communications.
Mm-hmm.
And then to consider the time investment and scheduling required for virtual engagement. So I'm just wondering, what are we saying here?
It's a really good question. I think we're kind of, and maybe this is where it gets too muddied. I think there's a lot of recognition about the potential and opportunity that virtual communications could offer in the space of providing services, but also acknowledging there's a potential barrier, as we talked about earlier, with the technology, the time constraints, that we can't just take every service that we do now in person and do it virtually and think that's going to be as effective or as time efficient or the consideration of what does it mean for everyone on each end of that communication, and is it going to work for everybody? So if it's, I think.
Well, maybe if you just said optimize that sentence, we're down in the second bullet point, I assume, optimize, and then say, but DCYF must consider the time investments in
Add one other consideration. When I read the statement, it really felt disconnected to the experience of the families, just by putting visitation and savings in the same sentence. So I don't know how well that, I get the value of the statement, but I don't know if I read that, I would lean towards, oh, they're worried about saving, right? And not the need for connection and, the value of in-person. There's been a ton of controversy about this particular subject matter. So I just want to bring that.
I appreciate that. And
Absolutely,
given,
yeah.
Go ahead, Representative, did you still want to?
No, that's a great point. So thank you. I agree with you.
Well, we could, I appreciate that too. And given that earlier we talk about communications, we are talking about don't make technology a barrier, this needs to happen. We need to make sure this works. We could either, this is a particular section about cost savings. So the potential here is that we could just take out this bullet point. I think the department on its own will try and, that depends on the comfort level here of the board, but if it's communicating that just save money and that means services could be less than what they need to be for families, we don't want to encourage that. So we could either keep it in and change the wording, or we could take it out and make sure that reflection on the necessity of supporting families and their experience that is elsewhere in the report, which I think it's reflected earlier on.
How about if we just leave the last sentence in?
DCYF must acknowledge and accommodate providers who have different levels of technology access. That one.
Yeah, that's good. The title and what we're talking about is optimizing, taking advantage of savings in order to shift resources to prevention. And there's, that seems an acceptable recommendation.
Wasn't the intent, maybe this isn't the right section, but wasn't the intent to talk about the opportunities that virtual communications can present to, for example, in areas that are having a hard time accessing services? Or is this not the right area for that? Because I think that if you're looking about, kind of looking at it as a sort of a win for families, that this is actually could be a positive thing for families who are not getting services, that speaks a lot more to me than talking about potential savings. I think it's very different. You're talking about very different things there.
No, yeah, it's a really good point, and you're right. I think this is maybe this is why it's a loaded bullet point, because I think there's several points within it. And it captures, I know early on in the year, we heard about even, and this is before COVID happened and we had some different conversations, but we even heard from some of our stakeholders, a conversation around on the east side of our state, the reimbursement, the mileage reimbursement, and the cost of making sure that people are getting to places where the services are provided, which is essential, but also acknowledging through COVID, we realized maybe some of these can be provided more easily and accessible in different ways. But again, this is about savings and budget there. So being sensitive to what Shonda brought up, being sensitive to wanting to align with what this section states. What I'm hearing is this last sentence is important, but maybe it doesn't belong here because that's not necessarily about cost savings. And then we want to make sure that this doesn't state that savings are more important than what the family and the youth need.
I would agree with removing all of that. I agree with what Sharon just said. It's been a hard year for families, and accessing services by remote and accessing contact with your family by remote has sucked, frankly, for most people. And so having it in this section does seem to kind of imply, oh, look, you can save a few dollars if you're not driving all over the place.
And I'll add, Krista, I'm thinking, the virtual offers an opportunity to maximize visitation. So it's not in light of in-person. It gives us far more times to kind of see children. So I don't know if you can capture that, because I think that's important. And I think that when we're looking at, I don't think it falls into preventative. I mean, I think that, you're in the system. So how is a visitation piece got into the preventative space? I'm puzzled, but
it's the savings that would be reinvested into prevention. That's how it contributes to prevention. I think that's what the title implies anyway. I'm not sure we've articulated that, but.
So what I'm hearing, and I hear all that, and so I'm thinking maybe we get rid of this bullet point here. This first part seems to communicate the wrong message. We do have a lot of guidance in our guiding principles, which are an appendix here. So we do provide that about the investing in prevention piece. Maybe we get rid of this first part, and then this last sentence we take and we move back up to the visitation section and capture what you were just talking about, Shonda, which is we want to make sure there's equitable, accessible visitation across all systems of care. But part of that is to ensure that there's opportunity here to supplement or maybe add on to in-person visitation in that with technology. But if you do choose to supplement with that, we want to make sure that this line here is captured, that that's not, everyone has access and the skills and the training to do so in a beneficial way. Would that work? And communicate the right thing? I want to make sure that we're not skimming on what the message is being communicated there.
This is Annie. I'd like to say, I like the word supplement, because we also had a conversation about small children and folks for whom, where services and all of that are limited anyways. They probably don't have access to broadband, which is another huge problem. So I love the idea of supplement for what it's worth.
Great, thank you.
I do, I'm not sure about getting rid of the entire bullet in that, and I wonder if it's maybe just encouraging the department to continue to reflect on any, best practices that they could build on to supplement in person. So I like because I don't want to lose the fact and acknowledge the specific area of visitation because of that very point that this has received so many renewals and of the executive statements, things like that. And so I think we should keep something in here about this, but I agree that it's the review for supplemental benefits versus just focusing on a savings.
But I think Shonda's point earlier, or Diane's, that a virtual communication provides an opportunity to reach families in new ways. And the department should evaluate its effectiveness and provide it as an option to families in the future, if they so choose.
Well, I think in order to reflect that, I'm wondering if that really does belong then up in the other piece of guidance, which is the equitable and accessible visitation. Focus,
yeah,
and not have it about the cost savings piece.
Mm-hmm.
Does everyone seem
right?
Yep.
So what I'm thinking, we'll take this, because I think that was, I think we did in our community this part. So here, seek to ensure both sides of virtual visitations have full equipment. Maybe we can add on context to this, both in adding this language to include this, but say it's the supplement.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And supplement it. Should we also want to say when by choice of the individuals involved, family members involved? You want to make sure that there's the choice factor.
Yeah, if chosen by families.
Yeah, put the parents in the driver's seat, or the families.
But we need to acknowledge that this is a required reality at the moment.
Yeah, right.
Maybe, okay. Well,
So if we're going to say it's at the choice of the families, that's broad enough so that if it is, for example, the adolescent's choice, then they're in the driver's seat too. It doesn't just take the parent, right?
Right.
So if families is broad enough wording.
And this does in the opening paragraph, to get what you just mentioned, Ruth, too, that the pandemic's kind of forced this to happen, and DCYF made it happen. So we do have that context. And then we go on to talk about making sure JR youth get access to visitations in some way. And then we can say here that ongoing, learning from COVID, ongoing, this could be a supplemental option if chosen by family members, but acknowledge the importance of in-person, and then also make sure that all levels of technology skills and equipment are available to make it happen.
Yeah.
That. Oh, okay. And I'll just write. And so if we do that, we have this here to say that the visitations, all sides have the appropriate equipment as well. So I can combine the two to make sure we capture the whole technology is not a barrier, skill, comfort, supplement, in person is still priority.
Good.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to take out this other bullet point then, because I think the way it's communicating is not the right message. So, okay.
Well, this is Diana. I'm not sure that we have going, I think it was Bobby's point, really effectively spoken to what is the number 5 priority of shifting investment into prevention. So if we were looking to say, optimize cost savings where possible and invest that, try and get that money invested in prevention, I'm not getting that from looking at the current bullets. So I don't know if we need to think about clarifying that.
Okay. Any more thoughts?
The primary strategy for increasing investment in prevention is the Families First Prevention Services Act.
Right.
So, maybe instead we should be urging the department to aggressively pursue opportunities to pull down FFPSA dollars to expand the array of resources available to families, prevention resources.
So we do have, we acknowledge the FFPSA in the opening paragraph, and my only, not to say I'm pushing back, but just that was, again, that hasn't been a topic that we've talked about with the department specifically as a board in a board meeting setting. I did want to take a quick look at the budget principles. So I don't remember if we do within here mention FFPSA. And I don't think.
There is a
Do
little reference above, Kristen. In
we-
parentheses, leverage state funding to maximize federal matching funds, FFPSA.
Oh, right here. Thank you. So it's not as called out specifically, but when that first bullet point in that section about optimized savings prevention the first reference is to our budget principle document, which we came up with earlier in the year. That is an appendices in this document. Do we want to call it out more distinctly, or are we comfortable with linking to this document, which is just a few pages later?
This is Annie Lee, and I guess one thing I still think we're waiting to see is whether sort of the requirements of FFPSA programs are so strict that they leave out some of the more creative and community-based, culturally relevant approaches. I think that's because of the rigor around the evaluation piece of those programs. I would lean towards not being so specific around that particular federal fund, but to just emphasize the prevention and leveraging piece.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And that was a topic. So we have it here actually as our 2021 going forward. I know that was a topic that we were discussing early this year about looking at not only FFPSA and finding out what's in there, but making sure there's that cultural responsivity piece there too. So there is something to be said that we haven't fully touched on this as a full board yet, and looking at that angle. So with that, do we, given what Annie just said in the conversation around it, do we want to?
Yeah, let's just drop it.
Okay. Okay, so that gives us the 2 bullets for this section. which refers to those guiding principles, which does touch on FFPSA, and we do bring it up in the beginning, but we can look at it as future work to make sure that it's still well-rounded, the services provided. And then we do have that cost savings around the lockdown facilities and reducing reliance on that to focus more on the community facilities. Okay.
Maybe reverse the order of that, increase resources for step down or to increase capacity. And then at the end, put reduced reliance on lockdown facilities so that it's more logically fits in this shift investment of resources.
Okay. Increase the capacity of means for youth currently in jail, that's a return to community settings. Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Is everyone supportive of that? Doesn't really change, I guess, the content, just the ordering. Okay. So moving on, we go into our specific program areas, which come again from quoted from specific input we heard from meetings. Any discussion on this first early learning piece? There was no changes since our last discussion, our last review of the draft on it. If there's any thoughts or additions to that.
Again, on the table, I think having strong licensing definitely improves child safety.
Oh, down on the table itself.
Right.
This one.
Right.
Got it. Okay. Hearing nothing else. So we can go on to the child welfare, which takes us back early on, like pretty much our very first meeting, then our most recent meeting. We kind of bookended a little bit about this year. Any thoughts or additional edits to the changes made in this first bullet about emergency placement options and reflecting on what we heard from the department few weeks ago, just a couple weeks ago? I also forgot to mention, we did add a bullet point here about the continuing progress in recruiting the diverse foster parent pool to reflect the youth. And this is linked to their memo, their press release the department has about what they're doing in that space. So kind of just continuing to encourage that. And then our last bullet point is about making sure the youth that do have the night-only foster stays, when that does occur, that they are treated well and humanely and not in any other manner when they're only there for the night.
So I think calling out, I don't know actually with the change in some of the nomenclature if group homes is the appropriate reference. Maybe Charles can help with that, but just expanding the options so it's not just therapeutic foster care and treatment foster care. I realize it says not limited to, but what other options, Charles, is the department pursuing? I know, $35 million was appropriated to try to expand placement options for hard to serve youth. What other options are there that we should include in the report?
I mean, I don't recall off the top of my head. I'm trying to think back to when we had Ross and Kwesi in this meeting, last month, and what they were telling us. One thing, one aspect is foster care training for our generic foster homes, but also doing more to identify and approve kinship care, I would think.
And I know that because I did go back and listen, my notes weren't fully reflective, that Quasi and Ross really talked about the treatment foster care beds and the grant money to pilot those starting this month. So that's specifically what they spoke to. They did talk a little bit about that kinship care placement, not at length. And I know that is, again, a discussion we want to have moving forward as a board. So if we wanted to add something in there, we could, but it wasn't necessarily a full discussion as well for this year. So that's up to you as a board if you want to include that piece.
Could you say something like such as exploring kinship, suitable other placements, something like that, like where it's not that we're dictating it, but we're at least giving examples of what they should be looking at? This is Annie Blackledge, sorry. I don't know if that makes sense.
We do, the sentence says explore alternative foster care modeling, including but not limited to therapeutic foster homes and treatment foster care beds. We could say therapeutic foster homes, comma, treatment foster care beds, and additional kinship placements, or wording around that, just to add the example of list of options to explore.
I like that. I also like the idea of adding, and I know we have not talked about this, so maybe it can't be in there at all, but the idea of suitable others has also been added to the RCWs and the law for older young people who may have someone who's not related, but could be a good caregiver.
Fictive parents.
Well, I don't like the term fictive. It makes me
I don't
sad.
either, but that's what's been used.
I know. Yeah. Yes, I think the term they use in the law is suitable adult placements.
Suitable adult, yeah.
Or other suitable adults.
Other, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Charles, are you cool with that as a representative of the social worker department?
Yeah, well, and I think that we have as a board, and I don't remember if it was this year or last year, but we have talked about the clearance requirements that the department has for unlicensed caregivers, which is kind of the lump term of both unlicensed relatives and suitable adults. And that the way that the bar is currently set is somewhat rigid and relies on a kind of a trickle down of the criminal justice system. And so all of the effects on racial disproportionality that are involved in that. But then also there's the matter of support for our unlicensed placements once we do place children with them. I feel like we've talked about all of that in this group at some point, but I can't remember exactly when.
Well, at least with respect to adolescents, it seems like we ought to, again, encourage leadership from the adolescent unit on that score.
So trying to capture all of that.
Particularly under the suitable other category.
Yeah, suitable other and kinship placements. I think those are things that,
yeah,
especially since we say explore alternative, this could be, again, a list of where to look, and then these could be topics that we as a board pick up specifically this next year to see what that would look like and ensure the department is adopting them or exploring them in an appropriate manner. Sharon, I know that you had your unmuted for a minute. I don't want to call you out if you didn't have something to add, but if you did, I wanted to give you time. Right now.
No, I was just, I mean, I'm not going to throw a wrench into it, but I mean, I guess in this particular, well, I am going to throw a wrench into it. I'm just thinking about the prevention space here that feels like it's a deficit. Because in child welfare, really, that's one of the key focuses that we want to start talking about. I went back and I looked at the budget piece, and in the budget piece, there's the where possible, number 2, where it says where possible, support community-based interventions and solutions to keep children and youth safe in their community instead of institutions. And I'm wondering if we can put something around out of child welfare, because that's one of the opportunities that possibly, if we're looking at utilizing community-based interventions, that they wouldn't just stay out of institutions, they would stay. I mean, are we calling child welfare an institution?
No, no.
Those are just my questions. So.
I think you should work that thought, Sharonda, because I understand what you're saying. We want the evolution from the least harm, keeping families intact, to, you know, up the pyramid if we've got to do more intensive interventions. So I like that. I think just workshop it a little bit for language.
So are we talking, so Sharon, I know you're reflecting on this part of the budget principles. Are you talking about adjusting the budget principles, or are you talking about specifically adding that to the child welfare piece that we were reviewing?
Yeah, that's why I was looking at both pieces, right? Because it felt like the child welfare piece didn't have language around that. Okay. And I know that, you know, we're focusing on areas that we've talked about as a board. So there's why the pieces around the emergency placement seems to be the priority in this particular section. I'm just wondering if there's a missed opportunity in there. So I'm just going to stay quiet because I didn't want to, I hadn't really completed my thought on that. So yeah, I'm just thinking about that. Because, and here's the other thing that really strikes me, if you wouldn't mind, is when you go down to the checked off list, right? We're talking about child welfare, and the areas around prevent child abuse and neglect aren't checked. Like, I mean, I'm just like, how is that even possible when we're talking about child welfare? Mm-hmm. So
improving child development. I mean, clearly providing safe placements is important to child development.
And I don't know necessarily if you can check that, right? But I'm just like, it just feels like there's a distinct problem with that it's not checked, particularly when we're talking about child welfare.
And just to add a little context, I mean, this, and not to say we can't go there, and I know this is something we try to do with the entire report, which is hard because everyone on this board has great expertise and knowledge and work in the field. We're just trying to be very precise to what has been discussed in board meetings this year, which obviously has not been completely comprehensive or been able to touch on many topics. And so here at the beginning, we do try and reflect on, okay, what have we heard about in a board meeting from a specific meeting topic? And then what does the board want to hear happen from that? So kind of touching back also on what we just heard from even our public comment of like, how do we do follow-up? How do we make sure that we keep the ball rolling? And not to say that these are not also very important things to add. So I'm not saying we shouldn't add that. I just want to put a little bit more context of why it shows up how it is. And that we've talked mostly about the emergency placements, the foster care recruitment, because that has come up, and then also the treatment of the youth from that original night only and emergency placements conversations. Mm-hmm. Obviously prevention has been a topic as well in some of our meetings. So if we want to add a bullet point, I'm more than happy to, and we can do the check marks to reflect those as well. That was just taking from what we've had in some of the meetings and including that. And if we've missed something, I'm happy to add it.
Did we not meet with the department on their strategic plan this year? Is that not?
We did, yeah. We met with them in February on their strategic plan.
So then they're in their strategic plan is around the decreasing of children coming into child welfare. That's his overall strategy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can say actually, I think we met them in January. You're right, in the same meeting, I believe that was the same topic.
That's a very good point, Sharonda. I think we should definitely add something.
It also reminds me of something that was discussed at the last meeting, which was, you know, and I think Kwesi and Ross kind of talked about it as a kind of a turf issue between departments, as far as interaction with DDA, but maybe more as a principle, to the extent that it's under DCYF's ability to advocate for bolstering the child behavioral health system.
Well, it sure should be.
And certainly at a minimum, coordinating with DDA certainly is a critical component to that.
Absolutely.
So we want to add, so we're going to add a bullet point about reducing the youth and child welfare system by 50% is reflected in their
Strategic plan.
To get to what Shauna was saying, which is definitely the prevention point. So I will add that. And then we want to add another bullet to talk about the coordination with DDA for the youth of the beds. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mhm.
Either
Yeah.
that or when we're talking about modeling, you know, I can't remember totally, but even around whether it's around modeling or in that, you know, alternate emergent placement options. A lot of that is in coordination, needs to be in coordination with DDA. So it could be as part of that bullet, depending on how you want to go.
Are people comfortable with that, adding the coordination with DDA there? Charles, would that capture what you were talking about, or would you prefer it as a separate bullet point?
What I was raising, I was thinking specifically with regard to avoiding hotel stays.
Okay.
But I think it also speaks to initial prevention in the first place. Could go either spot.
Oh, I agree with Charles. It should be near the hotel stays for sure. So I was thinking that it's regardless. I think it's probably a strategy around both, frankly. But hotel stays, I definitely think that's part of the strategy.
So in this section, the edits and changes are to add a bullet from one of our first meetings about regarding reducing youth overall in the child welfare system by 50% is reflected in the strategic plan. In the menu of alternate emergency placement options, we are adding in that explore alternate modeling to include therapeutic foster homes, therapeutic foster care beds, as well as kinship placements and other suitable other adult placements. And as part of that, we're also adding in the coordination, expected coordination with DDA regarding the beds for these youth that otherwise might end up in hotel stay placements.
Yeah, maybe to assure appropriate placement.
The coordination.
Avoid hotel stays.
The coordination with DDA on that.
Right. Ensure appropriate placement.
Okay. I'm going to add in October.
Actually, the motivation is not to avoid necessarily reliance on hotel stays, but to just assure that children and youth with developmental disabilities, that they receive appropriate placement.
Yeah, don't take it out altogether. I mean, I'd say coordinate with DDA to ensure appropriate placements and to avoid hotel placements.
Okay.
Do you agree, Ruth?
Yeah.
Because it really is both.
Okay, there's a lot of great discussion around that. Are we comfortable with those changes? I think so. Thank you for the high engagement on that piece. And we'll also make the check marks accordingly because I think that covers a lot more territory. So we'll edit those. And then moving on to our last part of the guidance section, which is the JR focus. again, here, the changes made were a expansion of the educational opportunities piece that we specifically heard from the youth back in our August meeting, about the opportunities they have for preparing for reentry and what life looks like as they transition to adulthood. And then we just clarified that the financial credit piece on the third bullet. Are there discussion, edit suggestions for this part?
So I don't know if you were able to incorporate the example at the federal level for foster youth.
Thank you, Annie. That did slip my mind. I do have, Annie had shared, she had mentioned our last meeting, and I think I have it.
I'm
Here.
sorry, for some reason I lost sound here. Not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay, I'm not sure. I'm gonna back out and come back in.
Okay. There was this, again, I know we didn't talk about it specifically, but it's a good reference point. I know the youth brought it up for us to consider. I'm going to share my screen to show what Annie, it's from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau regarding foster care children and credit reporting. So Annie had brought up in our last meeting that this is a good place for reference if we're talking about assisting youth in JR when they're first beginning to build credit and how to go about that, because this addresses it for the youth and child welfare. So the suggestion there would be to reference this as an example of what JR could look at as far as helping youth in JR to start building credit. Is this?
This is Annie. I think personally, just because I worked on this piece of work here, I think it makes sense. And I think it makes sense to say something like near for youth in JR, the federal practices that are set out for youth in foster care, or something like that. Because it's all just guidance. It's not mandatory. States decide whether they want to take it on or not. And I think it's something we could piggyback off of. I'm willing to be talked down too, folks. I'm not married to it, but I think it's a good start.
Well, I do too. And I mean, what we're trying to reference here is what the kids told us that were important to them.
Right.
This is Annie Lee, and I like keeping something like this in, and also it's an opportunity to think a little bit more deeply about all the other barriers that JR involved or juvenile justice involved young people face around records and restitution and huge debt coming out of that system. We haven't talked about it yet, but I think it's part of launching young people with the best step forward as we can. I think there's been lots, and that's not something DCYF necessarily has control over, but it's something that is super relevant around their success at launching young people off in a good way.
Yeah, I completely agree. But I also think that given that not DCYF, but ACF made a deal with the credit reporting companies, like, could we not pursue something at the state or federal level to do the same thing, which classifies those fines? It's a conversation for another day, but I think it's one that we really need to dive into too, even in this topic area.
Yeah, but I think this is Bobby. I think it is absolutely right on, but I don't know that it belongs in our 2020 report, which is, because it's a different kettle of fish. I mean, we may see why there's crossover, et cetera, but there's going to be just a harder time with these credit bureaus when we're talking about kids who have records.
Exactly. A conversation, a deeper conversation for another session is,
Yeah.
I'm hoping. Yeah, the evolution of this next year.
So do we want to, so hearing that, do we want to add in here, maybe explore for JR youth, the federal guidance that's developed for foster care youth as a place to start, or are we and then referencing that article that Annie said she'd worked on, and then use that as a way to move forward into 2021 as a further exploration of what that could look like? Or do we want, what are the thoughts on the language regarding this bullet point with this addition?
Well, I guess I'd like to say it's more than an article. There's a whole bunch of guidance sheets that go with it. And it is about freezing young people's credit when they come into care, and making sure that if there's anything negative on there, that it's dealt with prior to exit, and that they fully understand what's going on with their credit. It's not necessarily about establishing credit, which is what I heard our young people talk about, or dealing with negative marks that you yourself may have been attached to. So I think it's more about like looking at implementing practices, minus obviously the credit bureau agreements, because those don't exist at state level, and exploring that in the future.
Are we asking the department to explore it, or are we going to explore it?
I don't know. I need people's best thinking on that. I think it's bigger than us or the department, probably, in terms of the credit bureaus. But in terms of like the man to look at credit and note, like a lot of these kids have had identities stolen.
Yeah, yeah. But again, the context here is this report. I mean, I'm seeing a work item, an investigation point for 2021, which I think is totally right on. I'm just not sure where it belongs here, because we're giving directive to, or what is this called? Program area guidelines to the department now based upon what we've done in 2020.
I think based on what we heard from the young people, that freezing credit when they come into a facility or into foster care, which is already supposed to be there, makes sense as the first step. Then
okay, I mean, yeah, if you think it fits.
Well, I don't know that I do. Other people need to pipe up. I think it is the first step, credit healthiness for young people who've been through either system. And it wouldn't require credit bureaus signing off on that. It would be the young people and using their credit for them so nobody can use it while they're in.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I'm hesitant to put a recommendation that the department do something at this point, because we haven't really done our research on, what specifically we're recommending. So I'm inclined to go with really delving into this in 2021, so that we can be very clear about what we'd like to see happen.
I agree. If we're being consistent with the rest of our report, we're not including
Yeah,
recommendations that we didn't specifically discuss. And so I think we discussed exploring credit. I don't think we got any farther than that. So I think just mentioning it as an item, and it's something that Shonda and Rep Dent want to take on, and other folks on the board, I could see us exploring it further, but I agree. I think we should mention it and not be too specific.
It was my suggestion. I'm totally fine with that. I would like to be tasked with being the lead in that. Just given that a lot of work went into this for foster youth, and I don't see how foster youth are really any different than JR youth in the basics. And often they're the same youth. And then figuring out some sort of strategy, either in this group or somewhere around looking at fines and how they're treated, same way that healthcare expenses are now, or fines, or overdue unpaid bills are considered in credit scores for people who've really been stressed medical issues. So I'd like to help with that.
Great. And so what I'm hearing is maybe for this bullet point, we just maybe change even the word. We said develop mechanisms, but explore mechanisms. So for DCYF, given that we've heard that from the youth, our guidance would be for DCYF to start to explore what this would look like. And then we as a board could take it on more next year to further look into what DCYF would be responsible for in this space. Does that seem to work for everyone involved? I mean, we did hear it from a youth member. I do want to make sure we reflect that from that youth request, but also maybe we're at a place of exploring that for the department in this space and not expecting more than exploring those mechanisms right now. Okay. Since I'm hearing none, I'm going to move on, and that's the end of our guidance section. So then we go into, of course, the last page of the future work. So again, acknowledging the leadership of our current co-chairs and welcoming our new ones that were just elected today. Talking a little bit about the Oversight Strategy Subcommittee and the work that has begun and also is expected to continue into next year. And then acknowledging 2021 as having some areas of focus, but also really embracing that flexibility and responsiveness to either events going on around us, or particularly what we hear from providers or youth or families that bring it to the Oversight Board's attention that needs to be addressed. So unless there's any outstanding thoughts on that section. Okay. So having that, our plan is, and the hope is that we can go through a process of approving this today. Our plan is to finalize with these final edits. They're very small, minor edits today. Send you all a draft after this just to see the final product, but then we will submit it through the review process starting next week. So if we want to go to official, I don't know if we want to go to official vote around this, or if we want to, given that it's been a very productive and participatory and engaging process, move forward. I guess I'll hand it to the co-chairs to let you decide how you want to move forward with this, where we're at with this work product.
Well, so this is our last meeting. This is our last meeting, correct?
Yes, our last regularly scheduled meeting, yes.
Yeah, so I would call for a vote or I would like to discuss potentially calling for a vote to approve the report, with edits, assuming that kind of edit proofing, et cetera, will happen and we'll see it once again, but unless there's anything egregious, the tenor and tenor tone and content is approved.
So I'd like to move adoption of this report based on our discussion at this meeting and recognizing there will be minor revisions and a new introductory letter from the co-chairs.
This is Bridge. I would second it, please.
Any discussion? I would just say thank you, Krista. Editing on the fly is not easy, and you've done a yeoman's job to be patient and capture what we're saying, and then just, frankly, the writing of the entire report from the get-go is pretty remarkable. So thank you as well. So those would be my quick comments before we approve. Any other comments about the motion? Any additional conversation about the motion to approve the report as with edits, with like proofing, et cetera, edits to come, but otherwise, and a new letter from the chairs? All right. All those in favor of approving the report, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, please say nay.
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? Thank you. With that, the report is approved. Well done. Impressive.
Thank you all. That was very high engagement, and I really appreciate it. It makes writing it much easier when there's that much discussion and conversation around each topic. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I would just add, because shared prerogative, that I have to say that numerous points throughout this last discussion, I was kind of laughing and patting us all on the back for two particular things. One for hiring Krista, because she's doing such an amazing job. And then the other one was for choosing Sharonda as our next chair, because she was bringing such important perspective. And, you know, she'd be like, well, I was just going to be quiet. No, I'm not. And I'm like, absolutely, you shouldn't be. Your voice is so valuable. So I was, I caught myself smiling quite a bit, just reflecting on those two things. So just wanted to share that with everybody too.
Yeah.
Okay. Next.
So I think we are early, but I think the next agenda item is really to hand it over to the co-chairs for closing remarks and adjournment for today, unless there's any other discussion that would like to come up. I know we're anxious to get back to the news, but I'm sure everyone's watching it. So
Hopefully there is some.
I will I'll let Ruth have the last word since she had the first
I
word.
had one question
Oh, sure.
really quickly is, do you have a schedule of dates for our DCYF Oversight Board's meetings for the next year?
no, not yet. So what we're going to staff, because there's been some conversation about our meeting frequency, and especially during legislative session when it can get difficult because we have different board members that have different variability. So what we're going to do is we're sending out a survey. Staff will send out a survey in the next week or two is the max. But really trying to gather as much information from each of you about what works best, and also to make sure that we're effective in the work that we are doing. So again, to address, like, make sure we're doing follow-up from previous items, also make sure the department has enough time to prepare for certain things, and so on and so forth. So we don't have anything scheduled yet. There shouldn't be anything on your calendar, but we want to get that out as soon as possible. We know time gets very competitive. So keep an eye out for that survey, and we will, like I said earlier, continue to nag you all to make sure that we do get responses so we can make sure it's accommodating as many schedules as possible.
Any other questions? Okay, again, I would just like to thank everybody for your amazing participation this year, especially while we've been virtual, for your commitment to the children, youth, and families, and to this process, for your openness and willingness and energy in challenging both your co-chairs and the department and the status quo, for giving us your wisdom, your trust that your comments will be heard and validated and hopefully reflected in the materials, and your just continued involvement in this process and in this board for the betterment, again, of our kids and families across the state. It's an incredible honor to have been the co-chair of the DCYF Oversight Board, and I look forward to seeing the amazing things that this board and department will continue to do. Thank you, Krista, for making us look good. Nicholas, for keeping us on time and on technology, and Ruth, I know we will find many other ways and opportunities to continue to work together, and I look forward to those as well. So thank you as your initial co-chair.
Well, thank you. And I hope to also stay very engaged with the tremendous work you're doing in the legislature and in the community. It's been such an honor to be in this position. And, you know, as a legislator of many years, it is rare that you are able to pass a piece of legislation and then actually be engaged in supporting the implementation of it and seeing if it's working or not. And the Oversight Board has really been remarkable in all the perspectives that you bring, in the tremendous commitment you have to the vision of this department. And it is what we wanted when we created the Oversight Board. So without Krista and Nicholas and all of you, we wouldn't be able to see what is working and what isn't, and impact that as it rolls out. So I just am so grateful for this opportunity and the opportunity to serve with Tana and with all of you, and really wish you all well, and we'll see you in January. And thank you to each of you.
All right, thank you all. Have a good rest of your day and hopefully a peaceful rest of your week. We'll be in touch and look for emails from us all. Talk to you all soon.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.